I've been fascinated by the vaults from the Fallout series for many years now, and I have to give Fallout 3 special credit here as it was the game that introduced me to this series and thus the vault concept itself. So what better place to begin an exploration of the vaults than Fallout 3, it seems fitting. As most of you will know, being Fallout fans, most of Fallout's vaults were never actually meant to be straight up shelters. They were the platform for a whole metric ton of twisted social experiments. I won't massively go into the hows or whys of the bigger story here, I'll probably cover that in another video, but true to that theme of experimentation and weirdness, the vaults of the Capital Wasteland certainly delivered. Each of them, to a greater or lesser degree of horrifyingness, harboured a unique experiment with its own outcomes, as it were. So let's take a look at them, and I'll probably drop in a few thoughts as to what might have influenced the stories we find, and maybe some theories or ideas or personal takes on what's what with each of these vaults. Before we crack on, as ever, I want to thank the channel members and Patreon subscribers in particular for helping make these videos possible. And also, I would massively appreciate a like, share, subscribe, hype, etc. if you enjoy my stuff. Every little bit helps way more than you know, so thank you. Anyway, with that said, let's get started. We will begin where the game begins. Vault 101 is of course iconic as the starting location of Fallout 3, the player's birthplace and home until they venture out into the wasteland. The experiment of Vault 101 was relatively benign when compared to the other vaults. It was never meant to open. Now, for anyone with no familiarity with the vaults and their experiments, indefinite imprisonment wouldn't seem harmless or benign, but you'll see what I mean when we look into the other vaults later on. Anyway, according to Vault-Tech's plan, Vault 101 would stay closed indefinitely, allowing them to observe a society sealed off from the outside world for generations. The official Vault-Tech brief was to study the dynamics of an overseer's rule when no one ever enters or leaves the vault, essentially a perpetual isolation experiment. Unlike some other vaults, Vault 101 received no GEC device, which stands for Garden of Eden Creation Kit, and is a tool for effectively terraforming the surface, because if all went to plan with the experiment, its inhabitants would never need to leave the vault anyway. They were to live out their lives entirely underground, with Vault-Tech providing enough spare parts to keep systems running indefinitely, or effectively so anyway. As it turned out, Vault 101 did not remain completely sealed forever, but it tried to. For the first few generations, the overseers of 101 enforced the plan of complete isolationism. The original overseer, who was in office from 2077 to 2127, used propaganda and lies to maintain the illusion that the outside world was completely uninhabitable. This original overseer had periodic fake radio broadcasts played into the vault, recordings made pre-war, full of news about how nothing but death and destruction awaited outside, reinforcing the idea that in Vault 101 we are safe, outside there is no survival. This first overseer died naturally after 50 years, having of course prepared a successor to continue the experiment. The second overseer carried on the isolationist rule and even went a step further. They tried to conscript senior Vault members into becoming accomplices in maintaining the lie. Essentially, the overseers turned Vault 101 into a micro-totalitarian state where the mantra drilled into every resident was, "We are born in the vault, we live in the vault, and we die in the vault." This totalitarian vibe only got worse as time went by, as we will see. As we alluded to earlier, despite the intent to remain completely isolated, Vault 101 experienced breaches of its closed system. At some point, radroaches got into the vault, which implies an opening or at least a crack where the pests entered. This became a chronic issue. The vault had to periodically exterminate infestations. And at some point prior to 2241, leadership seemed to soften to the idea of actually opening up and exploring the wasteland. A survey team was sent out, with members making contact with Megaton, and some even remaining there to foster a working relationship between the vault and the settlement. Samples were returned to the vault and studied to see if the world was actually able to be resettled again. This phase of contact and exploration lasted for roughly 20 years, well, just short of 20 years, ending when the Overseer towards the end of this period went on an expedition to the outside world and vanished. With this event not exactly providing good PR for the safety of the outside world, Overseer Alphonse Almodovar took over and reinstated a policy of complete isolationism again. But, if anything, even more strictly than before. He wasn't completely successful with this though, as there were a few breaches under his tenure, leading up to a total collapse of the original plan for the vault. Firstly, there were a couple of vault residents who escaped between the start of his stint as Overseer and where the player starts the game in 2277. One of them completely vanished into the wastes without much of a trace, and the other reported to residents of Megaton that the vault had become completely totalitarian again. More significantly, in 2258, the vault opened to admit James and Catherine, the player's parents. They were both scientists, formerly of Project Purity, a plan to restore safe drinking water to the Capital Wasteland, and Catherine was pregnant with the Lone Wanderer. As it happened, Vault 101 had no resident doctor at the time, so Alphonse Almodovar allowed James to come in as the new vault physician. Catherine gave birth in the vault, but died from childbirth complications, unfortunately leaving James to raise the child inside Vault 101 alone. This event is significant because it contradicts the vault's supposed policy. It shows that Alphonse, despite being arguably more hardline than any overseers before him, was willing to bend the rules for the practical benefit of the vault. By 2277, Vault 101 is still led by Alphonse, and interestingly, the player character has formed a close bond with his daughter Amata. The game's story kicks off when James decides to leave the vault to resume his work on Project Purity. His departure is abrupt and unauthorized, throwing Vault 101 into violent chaos. The player then escapes the vault as well, chased by the Overseer's guards, in order to find James in the outside world. After the Lone Wanderer leaves, the Overseer cracks down harder than before on the vault's population, trying desperately to reinstate the status quo. Sometime later into their adventure, the player picks up a Vault 101 distress signal and can return to find the vault in the midst of a civil conflict. Overseer Almodovar's authoritarian rule, exacerbated by the recent escape, leads to a faction of vault dwellers led by Amata and some rebels pushing to open the vault to the outside, or at least reform governance. The end of this story is down to you, the player, and there are a number of ways this can play out, and it's not as simple as it seems in terms of the Overseer's reasoning. With a bit of digging around, you can discover that the Enclave tried to trick their way into the vault, which the Overseer denied, no doubt compounding his view that the outside world is dangerous. In fact, this information can even be used to convince Amata that the vault needs to remain closed. And, of course, if you decide just to take out all the rebels, the same outcome takes place. So as you can see, there are a few routes to ensuring the vault remains closed. On the other hand, the choice to have the vault opened can be played out in a number of ways too, either peacefully or through violence, depending on what you want to do. It's an excellent example of Fallout 3 giving lots of different options with many different possible outcomes and encounters. For instance, if the vault is opened, you may encounter some residents around the Capital Wasteland after the fact. If you botch the entire thing and Amata and her father are goners, you can come and go to the vault, but the residents will not be happy to see you and attack. Or if you decide you want to destroy the vault completely by wrecking the water chip, there's a cool little random encounter later on where you may find Amata being interrogated by the Enclave for the location of the vault. So, what might have influenced Vault 101's story and themes? The Vault's scenario is heavily influenced by dystopian fiction and social experiments regarding closed societies. The number 101 itself is almost certainly a direct nod to Room 101 in Orwell's 1984. In Orwell's novel, Room 101 is the torture chamber where a person is confronted with their worst fear. It's about breaking individuals' wills. Vault 101 thematically resonates with that because it is essentially a place of psychological control, the overseer as Big Brother, the lies about the outside. Beyond Orwell, Vault 101's perpetual isolation brings to mind generational ship sci-fi stories such as Heinlein's Orphans of the Sky, where generations are born and die in a closed environment, often forgetting their origins or purpose. In many such stories, the inhabitants often come to believe their sealed environment is the entire universe, just as Vault 101 dwellers are taught to think the vault is the only safe place and the outside is death. There is also a resemblance to Plato's cave allegory, people living their whole lives in a cave seeing shadows, unaware of the outside reality. In Vault 101, the residents see only the shadow of the outside world as painted by the Overseer's fake broadcasts, and never the real thing until someone leaves. Another possible influence is City of Ember, a 2003 novel about an underground city meant to sustain survivors for 200 plus years, which was then released as a movie in 2008. With the main difference being that the isolation was meant to eventually end and instructions were given, but lost. It's quite possible the Fallout 3 writers took some cues from that, especially as the City of Ember film was released around the same time Fallout 3 was. In both, the younger generation pushes against the status quo. Moving away from influences and looking at the message the story is trying to convey, Vault 101 thematically is a microcosm of that classic, forever ongoing debate in society: safety versus freedom. The Overseers maintain that the vault must remain closed for the inhabitants' own good, safety at the cost of liberty. The player's journey, escaping the vault, symbolises the urge for freedom, knowledge and growth, even though it involves risk. This is emphasised by the generational aspect. The original dwellers accepted isolation, but as we've noted earlier, the younger generation, Amata, the player, others, chafe against the lies. It's a pretty straightforward but effective allegory for youths questioning the traditions and protective deceptions of their parents' generation. Vault 101's experiment, of course, also explores authority and indoctrination. The Overseer is basically a dictator, but one propped up by myth. People genuinely believe life outside is impossible, so they acquiesce. This gets uncomfortably close to how some real-world regimes or cults keep members in check by fear of the outside, of the other. The Vault's eventual breakdown, I think, takes the position that truth and curiosity are irrepressible. Humans have an innate desire to explore and not live in a cage of lies. The truth will out, as it were, whatever the consequences may be. Moving west into the Capital Wasteland, we're going to take a look at Vault 106 next, which to me, and probably many others, is one of the more unsettling vaults in the game. So what is it that makes it so particularly unsettling? Well, Vault 106's experiment centred on the deliberate release of psychoactive chemicals into the air supply shortly after the vault sealed, with the objective being a long-term study of chemically induced psychosis within a confined population. This experiment targets perception itself, examining what happens when an entire community can no longer trust what it sees or experiences. According to available records, Vault 106 was completed in 2069 and designed to house 107 occupants, including both test subjects and research staff. Oversight of the experiment was assigned to personnel associated with Vault-Tech's Psychological Research Department, most specifically the Overseer, who was the head of said department. 10 days after the vault door was sealed, psychoactive compounds were introduced into the air filtration system. What's interesting is that the vault was designed with the duration of the experiment expected to last for 12 years and some change, which to me is absolutely incredible given what they were planning to do. How could they have expected to maintain the place for that long? Obviously, the inhabitants were not informed about the true nature of the event that was taking place. When residents began to notice unusual smells or sensations, security personnel were instructed to reassure them that a minor filtration irregularity had occurred and had already been corrected. Thus, even beyond the psychoactive compounds, residents were encouraged to doubt their own perceptions, reinforcing the destabilizing effect of the chemicals themselves. So you could look at it as a compounding breakdown of reality from the perspective of the residents. Compounds being released twisted everything in their minds and then being gaslit on top of it all. The effects of this varied between individuals. Some residents entered dissociative or euphoric states, while others became paranoid, erratic, or violent. Remaining evidence suggests the vault's collapse was progressive rather than instantaneous, though it does seem to have been quick. There were attempts at controlling the situation from security personnel. Confusion appears to have developed into fear and fear into aggression as the population struggled to interpret increasingly unreliable perceptions of reality. Once perception itself became completely messed up, communication and trust became extremely difficult to maintain. Environmental storytelling throughout the vault reinforces the impression of gradual psychological fragmentation. Living quarters, laboratories, and communal areas show signs of escalating disorder and conflict. Fragments of text left behind by residents suggest that some individuals retained enough clarity to understand that something was wrong and attempted to control their situation, or at least isolate themselves away from the chaos. The vault's systems continued operating long after the deaths of the original inhabitants. Psychoactive contamination persisted in the air supply for decades, meaning that later intruders entering the vault were also exposed. It seems that these later victims came to believe themselves to be members of the original population. So, in a way, the experiment in some form continued way beyond the original 12-year span, and completely without any guardrails or control at all. A sort of self-perpetuating madness running rampant for the foreseeable future. The Lone Wanderer experiences the vault's effects directly while exploring the place. Throughout the facility, the player encounters hallucinations of figures connected to Vault 101, including James, Amata, and members of the Tunnel Snakes, suggesting that the psychoactive compounds distort memory as well as sensory perception. Familiar figures become unreliable or threatening. As the player progresses deeper into the vault, the intensity of these hallucinations increases. The final confrontation, as it were, occurs near the deepest levels, where a resident named the Survivor attacks while still under the influence of the vault's airborne chemicals. Once this crazed denizen has been dealt with, if the player explores a bit, they will find evidence that some residents attempted to escape through a collapsed tunnel system at the rear of the facility. Skeletons and heavy weaponry found in this area imply that at least a small group attempted to blast their way out using a mini-nuke. So it would seem that even under severe psychological degradation, some individuals retained enough awareness of danger to attempt escape. It's a pretty bleak bit of storytelling, all told. And when it comes to storytelling influences, Vault 106 obviously was inspired by stories in which characters cannot rely on their senses, creating uncertainty about what is real and what is imagined. We can't know for sure specifically what inspired it. Feel free to correct me if I've missed any developer comments. So I had my own thought as to what might possibly have been on the minds of those responsible for the Vault's story. Jacob's Ladder, for example, could have been an influence. Similar to what happened to the residents of Vault 106, its protagonist goes through an experience caused by chemicals, where perception becomes increasingly unstable, producing visions that completely break reality. Not only that, the chemicals were seemingly part of a secret government experiment, with the participants completely unaware of being administered them at all. As to what else might have been an influence, or whether Jacob's Ladder played into it at all, I have no real clue, but it's interesting to consider nonetheless. In terms of themes, Vault 106 is a really good example of the deceptive fragility of the shared reality we rely upon as the foundation of social order. Many Vault experiments manipulate authority, resources, or social roles. But Vault 106 attacks the cognitive processes that allow individuals to interpret the world consistently. Once perception becomes unreliable, cooperation becomes extremely difficult to sustain. Trust depends on agreement about what is happening, about what reality actually is. And when that agreement collapses, social cohesion collapses right along with it. There's also a strong theme of institutional betrayal, which links back to Jacob's Ladder, and of course is present in all the Vault stories, but I think is particularly strong with Vault 106. Why is that? Well, think about how basic the attack is here on one of the fundamentals. Access to air is one of the most basic guarantees of survival. By using that system as the delivery mechanism for psychoactive chemicals, Vault-Tec takes advantage of perhaps their most basic responsibility to the residents: their ability to breathe safely. It's not like the residents can just choose not to breathe. It is an absolutely brutal tearing to shreds of trust, even for Vault-Tec. Next, we're moving on to Vault 112, located further west again from Vaults 101 and 106, hidden under Smith Case's garage. It was one of the last vaults built, and probably, to my view, one of the most nefarious in concept. It was never meant to house a large population, only 85 occupants were intended. Those few lucky souls were to be suspended in stasis pods, connected to a vast virtual reality simulator that would run for centuries and provide an idyllic life. At least that was the pitch. In reality, Vault 112 was essentially the personal playground of its overseer, Dr. Stanislaus Braun. Braun was a pre-war genius scientist, the mind behind the Garden of Eden creation kit, and a member of Vault-Tec's upper echelons. Vault 112 was built to Braun's specifications, fulfilling his desire to cheat death and play God in a controlled environment. When the Great War came, Braun and 84 other individuals sealed themselves in Vault 112 and entered the Tranquility Loungers, specialised life support pods that interface with the VR simulation. The simulation started with various utopias to keep everyone entertained indefinitely. Over time, Braun tried multiple scenarios. Logs in the vault mention simulated paradises like Toucan Lagoon and Slalom Chalet, where you could live out different fantasies. However, Braun, being a now effectively immortal genius with a sadistic streak, quickly grew bored of perfect utopias. Instead, he began to use the simulation to indulge his darkest impulses. Because he had absolute control, he could reshape the virtual world at will, and the other vault dwellers were essentially his unwitting puppets. They had no way to exit on their own or remember their real selves once plugged in. Braun's pattern of behaviour was horrifying. He would amuse himself by murdering the simulation inhabitants in gruesome ways, then wipe their memories and reset the simulation over and over. Each vault resident effectively experienced countless nightmare deaths without ever understanding the truth. In one scenario, Braun dropped his neighbours on a tropical island full of sharks, delighting as one was eaten repeatedly, and another died of scurvy, until he got bored. In another, a snowy mountain town, he caused avalanches, frostbite, and impaled someone on a fence, again resetting when it no longer amused him. Finally, Braun settled on Tranquility Lane, a simulation of a black and white 1950s suburban neighbourhood, a sort of Americana paradise. There, he took the form of a little girl named Betty, an innocent facade for his monstrous desires. He again erased the residents' memories entirely, making them believe they had always lived in this neighbourhood. The brilliance of this scenario for Bronn was that the people felt safe and content, which made it all the more impactful when he would shatter the peace with some twisted event. In the quest Tranquility Lane, Bronn, as Betty, tries to coerce the Lone Wanderer into performing cruel pranks, escalating to outright murder of residents, purely for his entertainment. This includes things like making a child cry or breaking up a marriage, culminating in a horrible task to don a mask and butcher everyone as the pint-sized slasher. All just a game to him. So, how did the Lone Wanderer end up in this nightmare in the first place? Well, after leaving Vault 101, James comes to Vault 112 seeking Bronn's knowledge, and the Gek, to aid his work with Project Purity. Upon discovering Bronn alive in the simulation, James enters a pod to talk to him. Bronn, delighted to have a new guest, traps James in the simulation as a dog. When the Lone Wanderer arrives, they too must enter the VR to rescue Dad. Inside, you eventually learn from the one person retaining any memories of Bronn's nightmarish actions, Old Lady Dithers, that there is a failsafe terminal, and this hidden terminal, if activated with a certain sequence, triggers the Chinese invasion program, a simulated event where Chinese commando NPCs flood Tranquility Lane and gun down all the residents, permanently killing them in reality as well. The failsafe was Bronn's own doing. In a rare moment of foresight, he had prepared a way to euthanize everyone if immortality became truly unbearable. But when he discovered it wouldn't kill him, overseer privileges kept him alive, he shelved it, disappointed but also unwilling to lose his playthings. The Lone Wanderer can choose to activate this failsafe, granting Bronn's victims actual death, which is paradoxically a mercy given their endless torment. Bronn is left utterly alone, trapped in a now empty simulation for eternity. Hell, so to speak. Alternatively, the player can simply do Bronn's sadistic tasks until he wins and lets them and James go free, leaving the others still stuck in his nightmare. Either way, afterwards the player and James leave Vault 112, leaving Bronn and any other survivors, if not fail-safed, in the pods. Vault 112's scenario is rich with references. The most prominent to me is the Twilight Zone influence. The devs confirmed that Bronn's simulation persona Betty was partly inspired by Anthony Fremont from the Twilight Zone episode It's a Good Life. In that episode, a powerful 6-year-old boy holds an isolated town hostage with his godlike psychic powers, punishing anyone who displeases him. Townsfolk must think good thoughts only, or he will wish them into the cornfield, essentially erasing or killing them. Bronn as Betty is exactly this, an apparently innocent child with omnipotent control terrorizing adults. The 1950s suburb setting itself references the idyllic portrayals of American life in media like Leave It to Beaver or The Donna Reed Show, but subverted into horror. It's also similar in vibes, if not exactly in story, to the film Pleasantville, which came out in 1998, where characters in a 50s TV world start experiencing disruption and changes from black and white to colour as real-life issues surface. Vault 112's design, pods with life support, also fits into the sci-fi trend of transhumanism and seeking immortality through machines. Bronn achieved digital godhood at the cost of his own humanity. I feel like, again, vibe-wise, there's influence from Ray Bradbury's works. He often juxtaposed mid-century settings with sci-fi horror, for example, The Veldt about kids in a VR nursery that becomes deadly. The whole Tranquility Lane scenario is something Bradbury could have written, a nostalgic neighbourhood turned lethal by technology and cruelty. As an aside, I'm a huge Bradbury fan and highly recommend you add his works to your reading lists. Anyway, let's look at themes now. The overarching one here, of course, is absolute power corrupting absolutely. Braun's story is a deliciously twisted commentary on the desire to escape death and pain. He got what many would consider a dream, an effectively endless life in a perfect world of his own creation. But instead of enlightenment or even simple contentment, he devolved into a monster, using his power to torture others out of sheer boredom. Braun had no checks on his power and no society to answer to, and thus indulged his every dark whim. It's important to remember that Braun's initial goal might have been noble or at least understandable, to live in utopia forever. But without challenge or mortality to give meaning, he became increasingly depraved. There's a sense that Vault 112 is a hell of Braun's own making, and more disturbingly, one that would be inevitable if any human, no matter how good in real life, was given such power and control. We could also look at the ethics of escapism. Vault 112 was sold as salvation from the horrors of nuclear war, a way to live in bliss while the world burned. Yet what did that yield? A stagnant fantasy that turned nightmarish. It tears up the concept of a perfect life if it's not real. Prior to Braun's sadistic arc, the Vault dwellers in the simulation had a relatively pleasant experience. But it was all increasingly meaningless as they had their agency stripped away, even before it turned uber depraved. This ties philosophically to Robert Nozick's experience machine thought experiment. Would you plug yourself into a machine that gives you only pleasurable experiences, or do you value reality? Vault 112 shows the dark side of that. Even if one man wanted it, he abused it. And everyone else trapped in it lost everything, their families, their free will, and eventually their lives, so one person could play God. Next, we're moving from virtual reality environments to real-world horror. Well, in the game anyway. Vault 87, just to the northwest of Vault 112, is the birthplace of the Capital Wasteland's super mutant horde. Unlike most vaults which housed families, Vault 87 secretly became a scientific laboratory devoted to testing the forced evolutionary virus, FEV, on unwitting human subjects. Construction of the vault finished in 2071, and initially it had a conventional social experiment planned. But that was scrapped in 2076 when the military and Vault Tech repurposed the facility for FEV research. Dr. Wayne Merrick and his team took over, renaming it the Evolutionary Experimentation Program. When the vault sealed during the Great War in October 2077, the residents were unknowingly at the mercy of these horrifying experiments. Merrick's logs detail how selected vault dwellers were injected with various strains of FEV. The results were predictably gruesome. Within 10 days, subjects developed thickened skin and immense upper body strength. But soon after, they also showed loss of cognitive function and extreme aggression. One female subject died from massive brain failure, and within 2 weeks, every test subject had to be terminated as they descended into violent madness. Basically, Vault 87's initial FEV trials failed to create obedient super soldiers. Instead, they created raging, brutish mutants. Of course, the story doesn't end there. About a year after the vault was sealed shut, some of the FEV test victims, now super mutants, broke out of containment and overran the vault. The overseer and security staff were no match for the mutant inmates once they rebelled. The mutants killed or converted the remaining human population of Vault 87, effectively taking over the vault as their own base. From this new Vault 87 army, super mutants began venturing outside. They kidnapped wastelanders and dragged them back to the vault's labs to expose them to FEV, swelling their numbers with each transformed captive. So this explains why the Capital Wasteland is crawling with super mutants. For nearly 2 centuries, these mutants proliferated, turning the surrounding area into a war zone. Vault 87 itself became a mutant stronghold full of makeshift cages, gore, and repurposed vault technology. The mutants obviously weren't anywhere near being technical geniuses. By 2277, the vault had fallen into severe disrepair due to their neglect. But they kept the FEV vats running. Their goal was simple: find more humans to transform, since they were sterile and needed fresh blood to expand their ranks. Also, around the time of Fallout 3, the mutants had started to exhaust their FEV supply, which is why we see evidence of them actively hunting for more. As an interesting side note, you encounter Fox in the vault, a super mutant and possible companion who was considered a failed experiment by the other super mutants because he seemed to retain his sanity. Unfortunately for poor Fox, they decided to imprison him and kept him around as a sort of sideshow exhibit they would gawk at. This led to him being stuck in a tiny room for a long period of time before the lone wanderer comes along and frees him. Vault 87 is also notorious for its lethal radiation zone at the entrance. The front door of the vault was ground zero for a direct nuclear hit in the war, which flooded the entrance area with off-the-charts radiation, 4,000 plus rads a second at the epicenter. In fact, an unused Vault 87 overseer log, found in the game files as cut content, explicitly states, due to a direct hit from a nuclear weapon on the entry area of Vault 87, the main door is damaged beyond repair and we are detecting extremely high levels of lethal radiation outside. So this explains why in-game the normal vault entrance is completely inaccessible. The lone wanderer would die instantly if they tried to go in that way. Instead, the only way in is through Little Lamplight's caverns connecting to a back entrance. So, as we've done with the other vaults, we're going to take a look at what might have influenced the story here. It very clearly drinks from the well of classic mad science and super soldier tropes. The idea of using a virus or chemical to force human evolution recalls many sci-fi and comic book themes. For example, the backstory is a bit like a twisted version of Marvel's Captain America experiment. Here, the super soldier serum creates grotesque hulks rather than noble heroes. As many of you will know, but is important to be noted for those who don't, the forced evolutionary virus itself was introduced in the original Fallout, and that original instance likely took inspiration from sources like, for instance, H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau, vivisection and experiments to create advanced beings. Vault 87, similarly to the original Fallout's lore, basically transplants those ideas into the Fallout universe's retro-futuristic style. The resulting super mutants are reminiscent of orcs or trolls from fantasy, but scientifically created. A concept that might also bring to mind Frankenstein's monster or Jekyll and Hyde in literature, scientists trying to improve humans but instead unleashing the beast within. Cinematically, one could compare Vault 87's scenario to movies like Alien Resurrection, where scientists' cloning experiments on Ripley lead to deformed monstrosities locked in vats. We could also look at the presence of mutants kidnapping humans to propagate their kind, drawing a parallel to sci-fi like Invasion of the Body Snatchers or even the zombie genre. One bite and you become one of the horde. Obviously, given the aesthetic of the Fallout series, it gives these tropes their own spin grounded in 1950s radiation paranoia, reminiscent of B-movies and comic books from where exposure to atomic substances turns people into monsters. So what are the themes here? Well, Vault 87 to me is a pretty obvious cautionary tale about the perversion of science and government secrecy. The thematic undercurrent is that pursuit of power. In this case, creating super soldiers leads to the loss of humanity, both literally and figuratively. The humans subjected to FEV lost their humanity to become hulking, aggressive mutants, and Vault-Tec, along with the US government, lost its moral humanity by conducting such experiments on Vault residents in the first place. There is also a theme of irony. The experiment intended to ensure America's military superiority ironically produced one of the Wasteland's greatest threats to survivors. Vault 87 embodies the idea that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. If indeed the intention was to help humanity survive by evolving, it backfired horribly. Of course, it's hard to trust good intentions in the Fallout universe anyway. Another theme is loss of identity. The FEV process rendered its subjects asexual, sterile, and largely mindless. They are no longer the people they were, unlike some West Coast super mutants in earlier Fallout games who retained intelligence or personality. Fox aside, we see that Vault 87 mutants are uniformly violent and lacking much intelligence. Vault-Tec succeeded in creating an army, but one with no culture or purpose beyond destructive and irrational propagation for propagation's sake. Moving way to the north of the Capital Wasteland now, we find Vault 92, which was ostensibly created to be a safe haven for the world's greatest musicians. Before the Great War, Vault-Tec handpicked renowned violinists, composers, and other virtuosos and invited them to the Vault, promising it would preserve America's musical talent through the nuclear holocaust. Therefore, in 2077, these artists entered the Vault with hopes of safeguarding culture. But, as with all Vault-Tec vaults, there was a hidden agenda. Vault 92's true purpose was to test subliminal messaging via white noise audio on the population. In simpler terms, the Vault's scientists would pipe in an undercurrent of ultra-low frequency sound behind the music, containing hidden suggestions to influence the dwellers' minds. The ultimate goal was to see if this could create what would effectively be sleeper agents, ordinary people who could be triggered into a combat frenzy or obedience via audio cues. The artists of Vault 92, of course, had no idea they were actually test subjects in a military experiment called White Noise Mind Suggestion Combat Experimentation. For a time after the Vault sealed, things proceeded normally. The Vault was well equipped with sound studios, instruments, and recording gear to make the residents feel at home. The overseer, Richard Rubin, and a scientist named Professor John Malleus began small-scale tests by playing the subliminal-laced white noise in isolated sound booths. Early results looked promising. About 1/3 of test subjects fell into a trance-like state during these sessions, and the researchers could implant subtle behavioural tics that the subjects would later perform without realising. Encouraged by this, Overseer Rubin expanded the experiment. He covertly wired the white noise generators into the entire Vault's PA system, even the living quarters, so that no one could escape continuous exposure. The Vault dwellers noticed something was off. A few complained of odd audio artifacts, the occasional odd pitch, but largely they remained oblivious to the true nature of the noise. Then the situation deteriorated rapidly. The hidden white noise began causing neurological damage and psychosis in some residents. The Overseer's logs chronicle the Vault's downward spiral. The first major incident was subject V920717, a musician who went insane, murdering 3 other dwellers in a bloody rage. Before security gunned him down, it took 23 bullets to drop him, demonstrating an unnaturally high pain tolerance and strength. Despite the chaotic nature of this event, this was exactly the kind of result Overseer Rubin wanted, a seemingly mild-mannered person turned into a relentless killer by the subliminal signal. He noted the loss of life was negligible and the behaviour proof of the project's importance, a chilling lack of empathy. Professor Malleus, on the other hand, was alarmed and started questioning the experiment. Despite the obvious danger, Rubin pressed on, intensifying the program. Over the next month, 10 more dwellers succumbed to the white noise's effects, leading to 7 additional fatalities. Musicians literally tearing colleagues limb from limb in sudden violent outbursts. The Vault began to resemble a war zone. Panicked survivors set up crude barricades, and the Vault's population split between the insane and those just trying to survive. Malleus pleaded with Overseer Rubin to stop the experiment, and even suggested they might have to abandon the Vault entirely to save whoever was left. Rubin refused. Desperate to regain some control, Overseer Rubin implemented a command phrase, "Sanity is not statistical," hidden in the white noise, which he hoped would pacify those driven mad, an attempt at a failsafe. This phrase is notably a quote from Orwell's 1984, which is a darkly fitting reference. We'll discuss that influence shortly. Anyway, unfortunately, by then it was too late. Around 30% of the Vault's population was fully insane, attacking others on sight, and the Orwellian code phrase failed to stop the violence. In a last-ditch effort, Professor Malleus tried to rally sane survivors to retake the Vault. There are hints in the logs that a group of residents armed themselves and attempted to fight back or escape. Overseer Rubin ordered Vault security to eliminate Professor Malleus, as if removing the dissenter would somehow salvage the situation. Malleus was shot but not killed outright. He learned from a dying guard about Rubin's full betrayal. Armed with this knowledge, Malleus resolved to confront and kill Overseer Rubin, though by then chaos reigned and it's unclear if he succeeded or died trying. Ultimately, Vault 92 completely fell apart. The logs imply everyone either died or fled. The Vault's structural integrity was also compromised. Earlier, constant sound vibrations and perhaps shoddy sighting led to cracks in the walls and flooding from a nearby underground lake. After the carnage, with no maintenance crews left, sections of the Vault flooded and became infested with wasteland creatures. Whether any Vault 92 dwellers escaped is left ambiguous. However, no known characters from Fallout 3 are explicitly former Vault 92 residents, so if they did escape, their fate is unknown. The safe conclusion to draw is that everyone succumbed to yet another Vault-Tec horror story. The world's finest musicians were essentially brainwashed and destroyed by their own music. The Vault remained a tomb of their instruments and recordings. Indeed, in Fallout 3 the player goes there in the quest Agatha's Song to retrieve a Soil Stradivarius violin amongst the wreckage. Vault 92's scenario is steeped in references, both implicit and explicit. The most direct one is the Vault's use of the phrase "sanity is not statistical" that was mentioned earlier. This line is a quotation from George Orwell's 1984. The phrase is part of a passage asserting that even if the majority believe a falsehood, it doesn't make it true. A meditation on objective reality versus mass delusion. Its use as a command phrase in the Vault is quite on the nose. The Overseer literally tries to use Orwellian mind control techniques to enforce sanity. A kind of ironic twist on it actually, as if Big Brother's slogans were repurposed to undo the very madness Vault-Tec caused. Anyway, this reference firmly plants Vault 92's experiment in the lineage of Orwellian dystopia. The Vault was effectively an Orwellian nightmare where unseen propaganda hijacked the inhabitants' free will. One could say Vault 92 took Big Brother is watching you and turned it into Big Brother is whispering in your ear. Additionally, many of the Vault dwellers' names are homages to famous musical figures. For example, Gordon Sumner appears on the inhabitant list, which is the real name of the musician Sting. There's a Zoe Hammerstein, a nod to Oscar Hammerstein II, a Broadway lyricist, whose diary you find, and she even mentions a musical. A tune from South Pacific is referenced, a Rodgers and Hammerstein production. The Overseer Richard Rubin is named as a homage to music producer Rick Rubin. Obviously, the developers had a bit of fun inserting musical Easter eggs, but they're also signposts of the Vault's thematic connection to real-world musical culture. The idea of weaponizing music taps into various pop culture veins. There have been urban legends and moral panics about subliminal messages in music in our own history. For instance, the 1980s scare that rock songs contained hidden satanic phrases when played backwards, or claims that certain albums triggered violence. Vault 92 is Fallout's amplified, pulpy sci-fi version of those fears. Here the backmasking is real and deliberate, turning peaceful artists into killers. We could also draw parallels to the concept of MK Ultra, which in the 1950s and 60s experimented with mind control via various means. While MK Ultra didn't specifically use sound, the notion of government researchers trying to implant suggestions in unwitting subjects is clearly alive and well in Vault 92's narrative. In fiction, the idea of an audio signal that causes madness or violence has appeared in various forms. But I think a fairly close contemporary to Fallout 3, Serenity, released in 2005, the Firefly movie, may well have influenced the writing here somewhat. It was revealed in the movie that an attempt to chemically pacify a planet's population led most of them to become so docile they died, and a small fraction became hyper-violent reavers. Vault 92's experiment is very similar in structure. An attempt to subliminally improve people into obedient soldiers ends up creating mindless berserkers. The Reavers parallel is quite close to me anyway, and it wouldn't be surprising to me at all if the Fallout writers took some inspiration from that concept, given Serenity came out a couple of years before the game. Vault 92 is also particularly poignant thematically because it juxtaposes high culture versus primal violence. On one level, it's a tragedy about how war, and perhaps the machine itself, for want of a better expression, perverts and destroys art. Or more broadly, human creativity. Everything is weaponized somehow. The world's finest musicians sought to preserve music for posterity, but the government turned them into guinea pigs and their music into a weapon. That sends a message about how totalitarian or militaristic mindsets view human creativity, something to exploit and sacrifice rather than cherish. Another theme is the fragility of civility. Vault 92's residents were presumably well-educated, civilized people, maestros and prodigies. And yet, under the influence, they became mindless brutes, a phrase Professor Malleus uses when he concludes the white noise was degenerating humans into primal states. It doesn't allow us to shy away from the scary truth that the veneer of civilization can be very thin. With the right or wrong stimulus, even the gentlest artist might become a monster. This resonates with Lord of the Flies, for instance, where the challenge for the reader is to accept that, in the right conditions, an island of isolated children could degenerate into carnage. The idea that, lurking just beneath societal norms, are violent instincts that can surface far more easily than we'd like to believe. And now we save the wackiest of all the Fallout 3 vaults for last. Vault 108, located way to the east of the Capital Wasteland, is best known to Fallout fans as the one with all the Garys. Indeed, by 2277, Vault 108 is overrun by a group of identical people, all of whom are named Gary and can only say one word: Gary, usually right before trying to kill you. The origin of this bizarre situation lies, surprisingly enough, not in Vault 108's experiment, which was a multifaceted study in engineered societal breakdown, but rather some side experiments that were going on to do with cloning. The main experiment in Vault 108 was essentially to create a leadership vacuum under stressful conditions and observe the outcomes. Vault-Tec intentionally left many positions in the Vault's leadership hierarchy unfilled, beyond a few key roles like Chief of Security, Chief of Science, etc., which they did assign. The overseer selected for Vault 108, one Brodie Jones, was deliberately chosen because he had a rare terminal illness, a genetic predisposition to an aggressive form of cancer that Vault-Tec doctors predicted would kill him roughly 3 years into the Vault's operation. In other words, Vault-Tec designed it so that not long after the Vault sealed, the Overseer would die, leaving the Vault without its leader and with no formal succession plan. This was supposed to create internal power struggles or chaos, which Vault-Tec wanted to study. Very on brand, no? To compound the stress of this, Vault 108's primary power supply was set to fail after only 20 years, far short of the planned 38-year occupancy. The backup was an insufficient geothermal generator that couldn't power the whole vault, so they built in a future crisis of energy scarcity on top of the existing issues. They also provided 3 times the normal armory weapons and no entertainment systems, effectively seeding the vault for conflict with that lethal mix of firepower and boredom. So that's the scenario. Vault 108 dwellers, after some years, have an ill overseer who dies early, a looming electrical crisis, extra firepower laying around, and nothing fun to do. The likely result: factional infighting, armed conflict, and chaotic instability. Vault-Tec essentially built Vault 108 into a powder keg and lit the fuse. However, the above is, as I've pointed out, not entirely the cause of the Gary situation. In addition to the societal experiment, Vault 108 secretly housed a cloning lab. Scientists in the vault were conducting repetitive cloning on a particular individual named Gary. A holotape found in-game reveals that every time they cloned Gary, the clone was hostile to non-clones, and that each successive clone became more violent than the last. They had cloned Gary at least 54 times, with similar results each time. The clones would immediately exhibit aggression towards all others, except fellow Garys. The scientists weren't sure what to do with all the Garys as they started cluttering the observation rooms. Gary 54, one of the later clones, finally injured a Dr. Peterson during an exam, indicating the situation was getting out of control. The log notes say that they planned to cull some of the clones to make room for more tests. Around that point, it seems the inevitable happened. The Gary clones rebelled or took control of the vault by force. There is no living human left in Vault 108 by 2277 except the clones, implying the Garys likely killed all the other residents, or the other residents died in conflicts caused by the other chaotic conditions and the clones remained. The vault is found in shambles when the Lone Wanderer arrives and is stalked by about a dozen Gary clones at various points, giggling "Gary, Gary," and attacking on sight. Each clone has a number designation, for example Gary 25, Gary 33, confirming many dozens were produced, or are continuing to be produced given the length of time since the vault was in operation. The clones have limited dialogue, basically saying their name in different tones: curious, angry, amused, which crazily enough is apparently how they communicate even with each other. The vault's state suggests that the regular vault dwellers likely had a civil war even before the clone uprising. Given all the weapons around, one theory is that Vault 108's human inhabitants started fighting for power when the Overseer died, and that in the chaos, the clones, initially contained in the lab, broke out and finished off whoever remained. Another possibility, of course, is that the clones themselves were a part of the intended catalyst Vault-Tec wanted, meaning they might have anticipated that clones would sow chaos. Imagine multiple versions of one person running around attacking people. I mean, it is definitely chaotic. By 2277, the Gary clones essentially are Vault 108's society, albeit a very primitive one. They have no culture or goal beyond basically defending their turf from all non-Garys. They even wear the original Vault Dwellers' clothes. One imagines the clones somehow emerging from the machine and deciding to dress themselves before running about madly, saying the one word they can actually speak. One or two are armed, others just use melee fists or tools, which could indicate that advanced thought, like using weapons, might be diminishing with successive clone generations. The later clones are more feral, perhaps. The vault is littered with bodies and is overall just eerie. Interestingly, we have it confirmed that at least one clone did leave the vault, Gary 23. As found in Fallout 3's DLC Operation Anchorage, the Brotherhood outcasts kidnapped Gary 23 to use his Pip-Boy for accessing a pre-war simulator. Gary 23, true to his Garyness, was incapable of following orders or communicating beyond Gary, so the outcasts eventually killed him to rip off the Pip-Boy, which didn't work in the end. Alas, Gary 23's life was sacrificed in vain. His remains are found at the outcast outpost with his arm amputated. Obviously then, the outside world learned of Vault 108's clones at least in a small way. The outcasts stumbled on a lone Gary and tried to exploit him. One wonders what other Wastelanders would make of the Gary clones wandering into settlements, for instance. The lack of them anywhere else would suggest that they probably were eliminated due to their unstoppably homicidal Garyness. The cloning aspect obviously echoes a variety of sci-fi sources in terms of influences. The idea of a clone that's hostile or degenerate relative to the original might have been influenced by things like the Michael Keaton comedy Multiplicity, which came out in 1996, where each copy of a copy becomes a more flawed person, albeit there it was played for laughs, whereas Gary's case is a lot darker, well, despite still being comedic in a way. This also ties to the concept of cloning decay, sometimes called the clone madness trope, often seen in fiction. For example, the Star Wars Expanded Universe had cloned Jedi going insane. It may seem a bit strange to look at themes in a serious way with the Gary Vault, but let's give it a try anyway. Vault 108's mishmash of experiments is a smorgasbord of the themes of identity, multiplicity, and the collapse of social order. The cloning element directly asks, what happens if you literally populate a vault with copies of the same individual? In Vault 108's case, it's disastrous. The clones have no empathy for anyone except their own copies, so community becomes impossible. It's almost a parody of extreme nepotism or tribalism. Gary clones only trust other Garys. It also could be taking a pretty unique look at the theme of self-cannibalization in a society. The Vault essentially, well, maybe literally, turned on itself, before the remnants homicidally defended the remaining cloned self. It kind of makes sense, kind of? In the end, there isn't too much to be said about the whole thing other than Gary. So there you have it, folks. That's been our little storytime tour of the vaults of Fallout 3. A proper mix of different influences and narratives, and definitely swinging from the truly bleak to the darkly comedic. Have I missed any obvious references? Do you have your own theories I might not have touched upon? Whatever the case, and whatever you want to say, drop it into the comments below. And thank you for sticking to the end of the video. Take care, and I'll see you next time.